So far we've taken a somewhat black box view of the backend. We've seen that it has a web service interface, and we've seen that we can interact with that interface using curl. We've seen that there are validation rules for records, and that those validation rules are captured by this thing called the JSON model. We've seen that there are user accounts, and you can log in as a user, and by providing your session token with each request, then you'll stay logged in. I want to now look at the controller layer of the backend. And the controller layer provides the REST endpoints that we've interacted with so far. So we'll have a look at how these are defined and the sort of functions that they provide. So we'll jump, this is the GitHub repository for ArchivesSpace, and we'll jump into the backend subproject. And as a fairly standard Ruby app, we have an app directory and controllers, models, etc. So I'll jump into the controllers directory, and we'll have a look at the accession controller since we've done most of our interaction with that so far. So you can see the accession controller provides a number of endpoints. So an endpoint corresponds to a HTTP request method like GET or POST, and also a URI. And so you might remember when we were using curl, we did a post and we would have posted to /repositories/to/accessions, and that created a new accession. And so you can see on line 29 here, I'll just make this font a little bigger. On line 29 here is the definition for the accession endpoint that creates new accessions. And you can see it's a post, it takes a repo ID in the URI, it has a description which says create an accession, and it takes two parameters. It takes an accession, which is defined to be an instance of a JSON model accession, so this is where JSON models come in. And you can see that we're expecting to receive that JSON model in the body of the request. We also have a repo ID, which it's going to pull out of the URI. We have permissions which control which users are allowed to do what. And so here we're saying that in order to create an accession, you must have been granted the update archival record function on this repository. So if you didn't have that, even if you were authenticated, if your user didn't have that permission, you would have received a permission denied error. Finally, we have a list of the HTTP status codes that this can return. Possibly not quite complete, but it's saying that you'll get a created response and a 200 code if all goes well. And you can see the body of the endpoint doesn't do very much. So in reality, we have a lot of these kind of endpoints, and it made sense to standardize them. So we have this handle create helper, which is going to create an instance of an accession model from the JSON model in the params accession hash. So moving down a little, you can see we have another endpoint here for a get on the list of all accessions. And as with the create, this takes a repo ID parameter. Unlike the create, this has an extra declaration for paginated, and that says that this endpoint will provide results in a paginated format. That means that you won't get all of the accessions, you might just get the first 20 or so, and it also implicitly means that you can provide page parameters to ask for a particular page of results. And as before, the body of this endpoint is quite small. We've pretty much delegated all of the work to this mysterious handle listing. So these endpoint definitions have a couple of benefits. One is that they're fairly declarative in nature, and that means that they lend themselves well to automatically generating API documentation. So it's quite easy for us to generate documentation that includes the list of required parameters for each endpoint, the permissions you'll need to be able to use it, and the HTTP status codes that you can expect to see from that endpoint. Another benefit is that the parameter handling can be centralized, so each endpoint can simply declare the parameters that it needs and the types they need to be, and it can assume that the underlying endpoint machinery will take care of parsing the user's request, making sure that everything's there, and parsing it into the appropriate format. And finally, one important property of endpoints is that they're transactional in nature, so each endpoint body runs within the context of a single database transaction by default. And so this means that if the user does a post request that updates several records and the very last update fails for some reason, the entire post request gets rolled back. So from the user's point of view, that's very nice. It means you do your updates that might touch lots of things, and you don't have to worry that if they fail, you might have left the system in an inconsistent state.